And over to you, Zoe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we're in chapter 20 this morning of 2 Samuel, and I'll just do a little brief overview of what's happened so far. So David has had to flee Jerusalem. That was back in chapter, let me just check, is it 18, I think, where he fled, or 16, 15, chapter 15 and 16. So we've had quite a few chapters actually of Absalom's conspiracy and David having to flee to escape his own son, and then Absalom and his army battling against David's army, and then sadly, or not so sadly I suppose, the death of Absalom, which obviously was sad for David, but it meant the end of this, well, we would hope the end of the conspiracy, but as we'll read now, sadly, there's more to come for David, which it feels a bit like, oh, is it never going to end? And is he ever going to be able to just rule in peace? But would someone be able to read 2 Samuel chapter 20, verses 1 to 3, please? Or I can read it if no one wants to.
I'll do it if no one else is going to volunteer.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I thought I saw you looking for the unmute, so I was.
1 to 3. Now a troublemaker named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite, happened to be there. He sounded the trumpet and shouted, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son, every man to his tent, O Israel." So all the men of Israel deserted David to follow Sheba, son of Bichri, but the men of Judah stayed by their king all the way from Jordan to Jerusalem. When David returned to his palace in Jerusalem, he took the 10 concubines he had left to take care of the palace and put them in a house under guard. He provided for them, but did not lie with them. They were kept in confinement till the day of their death, living as widows.
Thank you, Anne. So just from verse 1, do you notice anything about Sheba in particular?
He's a troublemaker.
Yes, yeah, troublemaker. So straight away we know that he's out to cause some mayhem. Anything else about him?
He was a Benjamite, so he came from the tribe of Benjamin.
Yeah, that's right. And do you remember about who else came from the tribe of Benjamin?
Saul.
Yeah.
Saul was the son. He came from the Benjamite, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. So it's quite interesting. We don't know for sure if Sheba was directly related to Saul and from that immediate family, but it is quite interesting that he's also from the same tribe. So he could kind of have hopes of some kind of claim to the throne possibly, and yeah, just to try and cause division as well, because once we read what he said, the last part of verse 1, what do you kind of make of what he's saying in this bit where he says, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son, every man to his tent, O Israel"?
He's stirring up sort of discontent about people, saying that they're not to follow David.
Yeah, definitely. I think so too, Julie.
He's not doing it quietly, though, is he? He sounded the trumpet and he shouted.
Yeah, that's a good point, Joyce, actually. Yeah, he's making it well known that he is not happy with David as king.
Also, calling David Jesse's son is actually quite a derogatory term, because it's pointing the people back to David's humble beginnings. Didn't call him the king, he called him Jesse's son.
Yeah, that's a good point, Joy, because, yeah, like you said, he's not referring in any way to David's royalty. He's, remembering where David came from. Yeah. anything else? Would anyone like to say anything else about this bit?
A lot of people followed him.
Yeah. So it says all the men of Israel. So they listened to this troublemaker Sheba and his way of creating division amongst the people of God. And do you know, I don't know if you kind of think this as well, is there anything in what Sheba is doing that is really going against God? So not only causing division, but in particular towards David and God.
Are you thinking that they're deserting the anointed one? God had appointed David and they're deserting him. So in a sense, they're turning their back on God as well.
Yeah, I think definitely, because Sheba's going against, like you said, Joy, the anointed one. So God said David would be king, and then Sheba's deliberately going against David and calling others to follow him, which they do. But the end of verse 2, I think that's quite special, because the men of Judah, they stay by their king, and I quite like that personal touch, their king. So they see him as their king, and they stay with him all the way from the River Jordan to Jerusalem. And David was from the tribe of Judah, and they remain loyal to him, which is special. So then we get in verse 3 this little bit about these concubines. Does anyone remember anything about these 10 concubines? It does actually mention that they were left to take care of the palace, but do you remember what else happened to them?
Absalom raped them.
Yeah. So these women were left to take care of David's palace when he had to flee, and then, as Joy said, Absalom raped them and slept with them in broad daylight on top of the roof.
Yeah.
And how does David treat them? Do you think it's out of kindness he's doing this, or what do you make of it, the way he treats them?
Well, having been raped, they were then regarded as sort of outcasts, really, because it was, so therefore they weren't really fit to be with anybody else if they'd been raped. They'd been, I can't think of the word. There's a word I was trying to think of, it won't come to my head, but yeah. So in a way, he was doing them a kindness by keeping them safe. But it looked a bit like, I think he might have let them go when they got past having relations, but they were kept there to their death.
Yeah, like you said, it seems, well, it says he put them in a house under guard, and then keeps them there until their death, which seems a bit, like you said, Julie, couldn't he have let them go after that? But then I also think, like you, that it seems that he is being quite kind, providing for them, taking care of them. Does anyone else have another view of it?
I wonder if they were to be let go, whether they would have been treated badly, perhaps. So maybe he was, by keeping them in the palace and providing for them, he was keeping them safe, perhaps, as well. I'm not sure.
Yeah, because the house under guard, you can't think, oh, maybe he's stopping them getting out, but it could be that he's stopping other people from getting to them and causing them more harm than they've already been through.
I was thinking of, I know it was before our time, but in the Second World War, where you had, say, women in France who were believed to have collaborated with the Nazis. I mean, they were treated horrendously, and we don't always know that was their choice, do we? So I don't know. I think this is a really difficult couple of verses. I haven't got a clue. You kind of toss a coin, don't you? One minute you think perhaps David's being kind, and the next minute you think he's being, oh, that's horrible.
Yeah,
Might
that's what I thought.
Might they have been stoned? I mean, as it was. I don't know if that was happening earlier, but I know later on we've read that the people who had sex like that were stoned.
Yeah.
So really, they should have stoned Absalom as well. But yeah.
I'm not sure about the stoning, but I know definitely that they would have been like. Do you remember we looked at Tamar as well, and she was raped by Amnon, and they were then spoiled, weren't they? Almost. So, no, they wouldn't necessarily have been able to marry someone else and be provided for in that way. So like Anne said, it's a bit like when I first read it, I thought, oh yeah, David's really kind because he's looking after them and taking care of these ladies. But then you could also see it that he's keeping them in confinement, and it seems not so kind to them. Did anyone have anything else they'd like to add to that? Okay, so we can move on to verses 4 to 13. And we could split it in half actually. Would 2 people be happy to read 3 or 4 verses each?
I'll read.
Oh,
I don't mind reading.
I'll read.
Yeah, I'll read as
Oh,
well.
you got
Okay, Leslie and Joy. If Leslie, you start and read 3 verses, so 4 to
7.
8, and then Joy, you could do the last part, please.
Right.
Including 8.
Yes, please. Yeah, 4
4
to
to
8.
8.
Yeah, that would be
Okay then. Okay. Then the king said to Amasa, summon the men of Judah to come to me within 3 days and be here yourself. But when Amasa went to summon Judah, he took longer than the time the king had set for him. David said to Abishai, now Sheba, son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom did. Take your master's men and pursue him, or he will find fortified cities and escape from us. So Joab's men and the Kerethites and Pelethites and all the mighty warriors went out under the command of Abishai. They marched out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri. While they were at the great rock in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Joab was wearing his military tunic, and strapped over it at his waist was a belt with a dagger in its sheath. As he stepped forward, it dropped out of its sheath.
Joab said to Amasa, how are you, my brother? Then Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. Amasa was not on his guard against the dagger in Joab's hand, and Joab plunged it into his belly, and his intestines spilled out on the ground. Without being stabbed again, Amasa died. Then Joab and his brother Abishai pursued Sheba, son of Bichri. One of Joab's men stood beside Amasa and said, whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab. Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the middle of the road, and the man saw that all the troops came to a halt there. When he realized that everyone who came up to Amasa stopped, he dragged him from the road into a field and threw a garment over him. After Amasa had been removed from the road, all the men went on with Joab to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri.
Thank you, Joy and Leslie. This is pretty gruesome now. I always seem to get the gruesome, horrible chapters, but never mind. So we've got Amasa again. And Amasa had sided with Absalom when Absalom conspired against David, and Amasa was the commander of Absalom's army. But if you remember last week in chapter 19, David forgave Amasa and he put him in place of David's army. So basically Joab had been sidelined and lost his place as the commander. And Amasa actually is related to Joab as well. They're cousins, or they were cousins. Yeah, so we see Amasa here. He's summoned by David to go and get all the troops together. But for one reason or another, Amasa doesn't do it in the allotted time that David gives him, which is 3 days. So then David gets Abishai, who is Joab's brother, and he asks him to come and gather the troops, which he does. And then we get this bit where Amasa finally comes to this rock in Gibeon, which is outside of Jerusalem. And then we get the meeting of Joab and Amasa. What do you think Joab's motives for murdering Amasa are, considering what's happened?
Could there be a bit of jealousy there, the fact that he had been sidelined and Amasa had taken over, maybe?
Yeah, I'd think so, because it was his position before under David that he was the commander of David's army. So Amasa suddenly being in his place, you can imagine he would be jealous of that. Does anyone think anything else why Joab stabbed him in such a gruesome way?
It was a totally unprepared attack, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He grabbed hold of his beard to give him a kiss. I'm so pleased to see you, sort of thing. And yet in his hand, he'd got a dagger and he was going to kill him. It's absolutely abysmal, isn't it? Absolutely awful. That somebody could say, yeah, mate, I'm really pleased to see you. But it wasn't like that at all, was it?
No, not at all. Yeah. Yes, it's deceitful, actually, isn't it, to be greeting him in that way. Say, how are you, my brother? And then next thing he stabs him in the belly.
Yeah.
Joab is quite ruthless, isn't he? Because he's done this. This is not the first time. This is his character. And it made me think, sent me back to Judas and giving Jesus a kiss in the garden.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of spirit, isn't it?
Yeah, Joy. Yeah, it's the third time, isn't it, that Joab has done this? Because if you remember right back in the beginning of 2 Samuel, he murdered Abner, who was the commander of Saul's army, and then he also killed Absalom, David's son, and Joab also murders these people when David had forgiven them. So, like Joy said, the spirit of Joab is like where it seems revenge, jealousy, and deceitfulness as well. And when it's in quite stark contrast to how David is forgiving, because in chapter 19 we saw David, he forgave Amasa, but then Joab takes it upon himself to go and kill Amasa, and in such a gruesome, deceitful way. I don't know, in some ways I think, is Joab doing it because of his loyalty to David? Because I think he is quite loyal to David in many ways. I read something which I thought summed up Joab quite well, that he's fiercely loyal but violently disobedient. So he's violent and disobedient to David because he doesn't forgive in the same way that David does, and he goes against David, but then he's also does do what David says, as we'll see later in this chapter. And it also feels a bit sad because David doesn't seem to question Joab. So with the murder of Absalom, it didn't appear that he did anything about that, which seems quite sad. Not to bring Joab to account on these things. So then we've got Amasa dead, wallowing in his blood, and they drag his body from the road so that the men aren't stopping and being distracted by this dead body. But then they continue with the job that they have been given. So the last part of verse 13, all the men went on with Joab to pursue Sheba, son of Bichri. Did anyone else want to add anything to that last bit we just read?
I think they probably removed the body because Amasa was supposed to be leading them. And when your leader is down, apparently everybody comes to a full stop. So I think Joab, that's where he's so much a commander of the army, knows that get rid of the body, then the men will continue on.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I kind of thought they were more stopping just because there was a dead body in the way. But if you're saying with the lead, if it's the leader of their army, yeah.
I think Job's quite interesting. I mean, interesting in a horrible sort of way, but he's typical of lots of human beings. So he's capable of intense loyalty in a sense. So he doesn't, in a sense, he doesn't leave David's side, does he? And fights on his behalf. And yet he is a wicked and horrible person. And I was thinking even of, you know, some of the great composers of some of the most beautiful music you can think of, who were highly immoral and unpleasant people. We are contradictions as human beings, aren't we? Yeah.
And also, don't you think, you know, sin was not dealt with, and the sin just grew and grew and grew. And I think that's a challenge to us, isn't it? That, you know, when we do things wrong, we have to put things right with God. Yeah.
It's a real weakness in David, isn't it? Which I don't think any of us want to see weaknesses in David, because we kind of want him of all people to be perfect. But he does not seem to face reality and deal with it.
No, that's a really good point, because we see it happen quite a lot, don't we? In the rape of Tamar, he didn't, didn't seem to be any consequences with Amnon, and then with Absalom, and then here as well. So that is a really good point, that this is quite a weakness of David, not to face up to the sin. And like Joy said, we need to learn from that ourselves, that when there is sin, to stop it and face up to it, and that there are consequences. And also, like you said, Anne, that we like to see David as this great man, but actually it points all the more to Jesus, who is the greatest and is perfect, and he's our saviour. So now we'll read verses, let me just remember which ones it was. So it's basically the end part. So verse, oh no, where did I put it? That's fine. Oh yeah, 14 to 22, that's it. I could read that actually, unless anyone would like to read verses 14 to 22.
I'll do it if you like.
Read it if you like. You've got two people, don't worry.
Yeah, maybe you could do the last part, Joyce. So I'll say, well, that's got quite a lot of difficult names. Would you?
Thank you very much.
So Julie, if you did say first just before Joyce, so 14 to 22, please.
Okay. Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel Beth Maachah, and through the entire region of the Berites, who gathered together and followed him. All the troops with Joab came and besieged Sheba in Abel Beth Maachah. They built a siege ramp up to the city, and it stood against the outer fortifications. While they were battering the wall to bring it down, a wise woman called from the city, "Listen, listen, tell Joab to come here so that I can speak to him." He went towards her and she asked, "Are you Joab?" "I am," he answered. She said, "Listen to what your servant has to say." "I'm listening," he said. She continued, "Long ago, as they used to say, get your answer at Abel, and that settled it. We are the peaceful and faithful in Israel. You are trying to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why do you want to swallow up the Lord's inheritance?" "Far be it from me," Joab replied. "Far be it from me to swallow up or destroy. That is not the case. A man named Sheba, son of Bichri, from the hill country of Ephraim, has lifted up his hand against the king, against David. Hand over this one man, and I'll withdraw from the city. The woman said to Joab, his head will be thrown to you from the wall. Then the woman went to all the people with her wise advice, and they cut off the head of Sheba, son of Bichri, and threw it to Joab. So he sounded the trumpet, and his men dispersed from the city, each returning to his home. Joab went back to the king in Jerusalem.
Thank you, Julie.
Joab, do you want me to finish it?
Oh, we could do that after, actually, Joyce.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, thank you, though. Yeah.
It's nice to see a wise woman sorting things out for them, isn't it?
Implying wise women are few and far between, Carol.
It reminds you of Rahab, doesn't it?
It's better than a
Jericho.
virtuous man.
And she was a fallen woman, wasn't she? I mean, she had a house of disrespect, but she was on God's side, wasn't she? And so she was saved.
Yeah.
And she became part of, was it David's inheritance? She certainly became a very, very well-known woman.
Yeah.
So this wise woman, not all women, were chucked one side then.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that, because that was going to be my first question, actually. How is this woman described? So we know she was wise. And her advice, what do you think of her advice? Because it does seem quite gruesome still, cutting off the head of Sheba, even though he's a troublemaker, and lobbing it over the wall.
But the inhabitants of the city wouldn't necessarily know that about him, would they? He would have just come. It wasn't until Joab said, we're after this man. So probably the inhabitants had no idea.
Yeah, that's true. So you're thinking they wouldn't necessarily want to just cut off a man's head who they know nothing about? Yeah, and Joab does describe him. He goes into quite a bit of detail, actually, in verse 21. A man named Sheba, son of Bichri, from the hill country of Ephraim, has lifted up his hand against the king, against David. Yeah, so the lady, she gives this wise advice to the citizens. So like Joy said, she and Joab explain that it would be better basically for one man to have his head chopped off rather than the whole city to be destroyed. And not only that it's better for the whole of the nation, because this man is rising up against David, against the Lord's anointed, as we talked about earlier. And for him to, just one man to die is better than for there to be trouble throughout Israel. So this woman is giving very wise advice. And yeah, and it's brave how she also cries out to Joab. And I think Joab, in the way here, it seems that he not exactly redeems himself, but he shows quite good characteristics here, because the dialogue between the woman and Joab, he's very respectful, and he also listens to her. The way he says, I'm listening, and then he obviously agrees as well to what she says. So in verse 20, he, in response to what she's saying about this city that is a mother in Israel, and also what part of the Lord's inheritance, he responds by saying, far be it from me. So he doesn't want to do that at all. He doesn't want to destroy a city. And continues, far be it from me to swallow up or destroy, which seems slightly ironic because he's just not long before destroyed Amasa. But then obviously in this case, he doesn't want to destroy. And then we see Sheba dealt with, his head chopped off and thrown over the wall. And then Joab and also the army, they return to their homes. And Joab, he goes back to the king in Jerusalem. So there's his loyalty, we see, going back to the king. But also, yeah, we don't know, but it doesn't seem like there's a question of how Joab has acted with Amasa. So he's managed to stop the uprising and got this troublemaker Sheba, but it doesn't appear that David deals with the other side of what Joab has done. There's also the contrast between Sheba, this troublemaker, going to this city, Beth Makkah, and the wise woman. So Sheba's a troublemaker, whereas the wise woman, she's a peacemaker. So I thought that's quite interesting to see the contrast between those two. But I must thank Anne for that, because we chatted about this before and she she pointed me to that, so I can't take the credit for that. Would anyone like to say anything else about this part?
I thought
Sorry.
she put herself in quite a lowly position. Although she was a wise woman, it says there, listen to what your servant has to say. She's not saying, hang on a minute, I'm in charge, I know what I'm doing. She's being quite humble before him, because he was a very important person, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, saying she's his servant. Yeah.
I mean, that's what surprises me, that he gave her the time of day, because he is this commander of this army, and she might have been a wise woman, but you know, she was a woman, but he does actually listen to her, which is quite surprises me, that he gives her the time of day, listens to her advice, and actually acts upon that advice as well.
There was a woman in the Bible who was a judge, wasn't it? Was it Deborah?
Yeah.
And she was a judge, wasn't she? She was in charge of people. So women weren't entirely downcast. There were a few around that were raised to higher positions, weren't they?
Yeah.
Sorry, come on, Anne.
You go, Joy.
Thank you. What's interesting is that this is not a Gentile city. This is part of Israel. So it's one part of Israel against another. And I get the impression that it's a problem that arises through misunderstanding. Yeah, you know, the city suddenly siege, the people there don't know exactly why. And then there's misunderstanding on the other side. But yet when two people talk together and sort it out, it's done and peace reigns. And I think that's quite a message, actually, that we need to talk things over and put things right, and peace can reign.
Yeah. Oh yeah, thank you, Jo.
I mean, on that same theme, really, because Joab didn't attempt to talk to anyone in the city in the first place, did he? He just goes at it hammer and tongs. He's going to take the city to bits. So he's acting, I mean, it must have been petrifying for the people inside, especially if they didn't know who this Sheba was who'd arrived. And you're right, that both Joab and this wise woman eventually face up to the situation as it is and look for a solution. They don't run away from it, whereas it looks as if David just runs away from things, you know, almost peace at any price, and it doesn't work, does it?
Yeah, that's good. And it's quite brave of the lady as well, isn't it, to stand up and say, listen, and call Joab to come and talk to her.
She's obviously very concerned about her, you know, everybody there. You know that little phrase in verse 18? It's obviously that get your answer at Hebel, which sort of implies that it had a reputation for being somewhere you went for the right answer. I don't know whether I'm reading something into that, but it gives that impression, doesn't it?
No, I think you are right, Joyce. It said in one of the commentaries that it was a place that was known for settling disputes.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I think that verse 19 is lovely, isn't it?
Oh, sorry, have I got the wrong one?
No. Where it says, it goes on from that, Joy. We are the peaceful and faithful in Israel. And you've got those two things together, haven't you? They're both peace lovers, but they're also faithful. So one isn't sort of outbalancing the other. Like that said of us, I think, wouldn't we? Peaceful and faithful.
Yeah, and she also takes action, doesn't she? She doesn't, I think you might have said this before, Anne, that she both of them together discussing it, they actually do something about it. Rather, yeah, I think it would you. And you said, whereas David just kind of lets it go, doesn't he? Doesn't face up to it. And
I think it was either Carol or Joy who said that, actually.
I keep saying, okay.
Good Joy.
So, Joyce, would you be happy to read the last few verses, 23 to 26, please?
Well, if you're happy to listen to it.
Yeah.
21, do you want me to start?
23.
Oh, 23.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is 23. Joab was over Israel's entire army. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. Adoniram was in charge of forced labor. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Shiva was secretary. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. And Ira, the Jairite, was David's priest.
Well done.
Yeah, I was going to say that was brilliant. Better than I could have pronounced them. All right, yeah, so now we have this little bit of administrative history of David's kingdom. It doesn't actually mention David, but we know he's king again. And verse 23, Joab is back as commander of Israel's entire army. And then we have all these other people. I won't say them again, but they're so they're real people, and David had a real kingdom. And yeah, so we can see from here that it seems that everything is back in order again. God's king is back on the throne, and yeah, it feels a bit like, that's a relief. Everything's okay now for David. And then we'll see in the last, I think there's another 4 chapters of 2 Samuel, what happens in David's, at the end of David's reign. And hopefully he has peace. But I read in one of the commentaries, which I thought was helpful, these last few chapters, back until chapter 15, and even before that, it feels quite out of control. And we have all these different characters, like Joab, who he's quite an ambiguous character. It's hard to make him out what he's actually trying to achieve. And we have murder, and we've had rape as well, and uprising and deceit, and people acting as if they're wise, but not actually. So it feels out of control. So these aren't my words. These are Tim Chester, who's written a commentary on 2 Samuel. It feels out of control, but God's word stands firm, and God is in control. We too live in an ambiguous world with ambiguous people, but God's word is utterly certain. When your life feels out of control, grasp hold of the promises of God, because they won't budge. They'll be like an anchor that holds you safe in the storms of life.
I think one of the easiest names to pronounce is Zadok. And I have got a book on Zadok the priest. And I think there was a musical. I'm sure I saw it somewhere in Fernham Hall in Fareham a long time ago. He has been made into a sort of hero. I'm not quite sure whether that's the right word, but a very notable man. He'd been mentioned a lot in Samuel anyway, hadn't he?
Yeah.
And there he was. He was in David's army.
Oh yeah, he's meant, as the priest, yeah. Were there any other questions or comments? Because that's the end of the study now.
Thank you, Zoe.
It's made us all want to be wise women, I think.
Wise woman.
It would be nice to think that in our church we might be considered, there's a wise woman over there.
Rather than, there's a flipping troublemaker for you.
Like Sheba.
Oh no, that was brilliant. Thank you, Zoe, for that. I think that was a
You're
really good,
welcome. Yeah, thanks for
good
listening.
explanation and good study. So I will stop the recording.